afternoon. The gospel story is a beautiful picture in Jesus' life and his ministry, in which we can see what Jesus sees, we can feel what Jesus feels, we can experience what Jesus experiences among the people. So the gospel story is a movement from compassion to mission. Moreover, the gospel story is both comforting and challenging. It comforts us because Jesus sees us and loves us with compassion. But it is also a challenge for all of us because Jesus sends us out to do a mission for him. So dear friends, the gospel story today begins with a saying. When Jesus saw the crowd, his heart was moved with pity for them because they were troubled and abandoned. So the heart of Jesus today is where everything begins. So when we look at the heart of Jesus, what do we see? When we experience and meditate on the sacred heart of Jesus, what do we see? So the heart of Jesus is not only a symbol for all of us. The heart of Jesus is not just an image. We hang on our families, in our church buildings, or in our body. Rather, the sacred heart of Jesus is the very center of God's love for humanity. The heart of Jesus reveals to us about where Jesus is and who God is for all of us. Not distant, not indifferent, but burning his love for human beings. Dear friends, in the Bible, we can experience the heart of Jesus by the way he acts, he behaves, he speaks, he encounters people. When Jesus sees the hungry, the sick, and the outcast, his heart is moved with pity for them. When Jesus encounters sinners, his heart is merciful. When Jesus encounters his enemies, his heart is forgiving. When Jesus encounters betrayal, his heart is faithful. When Jesus encounters persecution, suffering, or death, his heart is sacrificial. So the heart of Jesus began eating in the womb of Mary over 200 years ago, and it is still beating right here, right now, in all of us. The heart of Jesus is still beating in the church, in the sacraments, especially in the Holy Eucharist, and in our hearts. Therefore, the heart of Jesus should become the heart of each one of us. The compassion that we encounter from Jesus should become the compassion we need to extend to one another. My dear friends, when we don't see others with compassion, then our actions become empty. There is a danger in our spiritual life. It is not the danger of doing nothing, but it is the danger of doing everything without love, without compassion. Therefore, without compassion, our faith becomes just an idea. Our service becomes a burden. Without compassion, our charity becomes pride. Our truth becomes harshness. Without compassion, our church becomes nothing. and our life becomes meaningless. Therefore, our actions should become the sign of God's love for everybody. We are invited today and every day to do as Jesus does, to feel as Jesus feels, to experience as Jesus experiences in his ministry. But dear friends, remember the gospel story today doesn't stop at Jesus' compassion, but it moves quickly to Jesus' actions. Jesus sends his apostles out to do a mission for him. And likewise, Jesus sends us out to do a mission for him. Jesus sends us out to let people experience his heart, his compassion, and his love. Today and every day, Jesus sends us as he sends his apostles, as we read in the gospel. And before Jesus sends his apostles out to do a mission for him, we know that Jesus calls them. Jesus calls them by name. When Jesus calls his apostles, he calls those he wants. Jesus calls those he wants. This means Jesus doesn't call those the people want. Jesus doesn't call those Fatherhood ones. Jesus doesn't call those the people of all Saint Church wants. Instead, Jesus calls those he wants. In other words, God's calling doesn't depend on our family backgrounds. God's calling doesn't depend on our wisdom. God's calling doesn't depend on our age. God's calling doesn't depend on our level of education. We can see it clearly in the Bible. Jesus called Peter, who will deny him. Jesus called Judas, who will betray him. Jesus calls Matthew, a tax collector and a traitor of the Jews. Jesus calls Thomas, who will not believe in his resurrection. Jesus calls John and James, who desire earthly power and authority. God still calls them. Jesus still calls them because they are willing and open to God's ministry. They are willing and open to allow God to change their life and their identity. My dear friends, it is the same way for all of us. God still calls us. God still calls you and me, who may deny him, who may betray him, who may make a mistake, who may have many kinds and forms of limitations and weaknesses. Jesus calls us as we are, and then he forms us to become his disciples, to become his apostles. However, sometimes or many times, we think that we are not holy enough, we are not wise enough, we are not good enough to do a mission for Jesus, to do a mission for the church, to do a mission for people. But the gospel story today tells us God's calling is not based on our perfection, but on God's graces. What makes difference are not our ability, but our willingness. My dear friends, today and every day, Jesus is still calling all of us, calling you and me to participate in his plan of salvation. We are invited to say yes to God's calling, to say yes to the mission for Jesus, to say yes with our obedience, our commitment, our sacrifice. We know this. We are enough. We are enough to make a difference in this society. We are enough to make a difference in this church, this community, and we are enough to make a difference in our families. Thank you.
In the circle of love, in the circle